from Virginia, from the US, but since 2007 I've been living in Barcelona. First off, sometimes I have a tendency to start talking really fast. So if I do that, please just interrupt me. Like, don't be shy. Just like slow me down. Or if I say any words like that you don't recognize, or if there's something that you don't hear, like, please also just stop me. Also, sometimes like some Spanish or Catalan vocabulary like works its way into the talk. So like, please at any moment feel free to just like stop me to ask anything. Let's see. really like some brief background, just in case for anyone who doesn't know. Let's see. Barcelona is the capital of Catalonia, so sometimes I'll be referring to Spain as the Spanish state, and sometimes I'll be referring to Catalonia, which is, I mean, most of Catalonia is under the authority of the Spanish state, but part of it's in France. But in certain ways, it is sort of its own political reality. So, for example, one thing that's very relevant is that they have like a semi-autonomous government. So, like government, like within the Spanish state, which is somewhat federalistic, kind of exists at different levels. So there is a pretty important level of government on the level of Catalonia, just like in the Basque Country or Valencia or Andalusia or elsewhere. And also, for example, they have their own police force, which is the Mossos d'Esquadra. So if I say the Mossos or Mossos d'Esquadra, that's the police force of Catalonia, which operates in a way quite different from like the Policía Nacional or the Guardia Civil, which are like the different Spanish police forces. Let's see. Why am I talking about this? For me, the purpose is not to give an informative talk. I don't really care if people, memorize like the dates and learn like the facts and how many people were arrested and when the general strikes were and all that. I think it's fairly irrelevant for people in another country to be very well informed and to know the facts about what's going on in Barcelona or in the Spanish state. It could be interesting, but at best it's something of a hobby. What I think is important is to analyze strategies of participation in social movements, to analyze possibilities of struggles for revolution, and so that's basically my purpose. Obviously, Catalonia is very different. It's a very different place from Finland. It's a different context. And so also my goal isn't certainly not to romanticize anything. There are a lot of things that actually suck, even though they might come included lots of riots and fires and exciting things like that. So for me, the goal, or like what I hope that people take away from this, definitely isn't an attempt to reproduce or to copy things that happen there. But there are certain things that I think are, if not universal, very, very generalized, very common, in terms of certain patterns that take place in struggles and certain relationships that we might have with these social movements, with these struggles. So I think the most important thing is maybe a way of analyzing events, a way of relating to social conflict, and a way of participating in social struggles. So I'm sharing this with the hopes that it might be useful for reflection for struggles here. So yeah, and just kind of like reflection on that, like the United States, for example, is an extremely different context from Catalonia. There's like a high degree of social alienation. The state functions in a completely different way. But like I have noticed how it's like in my own life, it's been really useful to make these sort of comparisons and to contrast how things work in Catalonia, how things work in the US. And for example, anarchist participation in the plaza occupation movement in the Spanish state, which is right there on the timeline. That started a few months before the Occupy movement in the US. And things that anarchists were writing based on our experiences in the plaza occupation movement were influential for anarchists in the US in a completely different context, because they weren't trying to copy what we were doing, but they were sort of help generate ideas for how to participate in the social context. So that's basically my purpose for being here, is to hopefully share something that then you all can use and make your own and can incorporate into your daily reflections on the struggles that you're participating in here. Yeah. Just a quick question for all of you, because I guess we have this space until 8 o'clock.
We have, but until 9 actually.
Oh, okay.
But there's going to be sound check for the bands after 8, so
yeah.
it's going to be noisy.
So we have this until 8, but then we have another space that we can continue the conversation? Is that?
No, not really.
No?
No.
Okay.
It's
Alright.
official kind of.
Oh, happy first. Yeah, there is.
Okay.
No, it's not nice. It's
Alright.
yeah, people
Okay.
can go there like afterwards. But there's like just hangouts and stuff.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in Kallio.
Yeah, so there's like really a whole lot to talk about. It's impossible to cover it all. But afterwards, anyone who wants to will be hanging out and talking about this more in an informal way. So anything that I didn't go into in depth that we want to talk about more, we can do there. The basic things to talk about. So yeah, my question is what's most interesting to go into depth in now. So just shout it out. There's like the basic things that I want to talk about are anarchist responses to austerity. In part, like the general strikes, participating in organizing general strikes and things like that. Anarchist critiques of the direct democracy movement and the plaza occupation movement. The Can Vies uprising, which was like a week's worth of riots that stopped the eviction of a squatted social center. The use of the anti-terrorism laws against anarchists and sort of repression targeting anarchists. And then the fifth thing would be the very recent climate of these new far left-wing parties that are being quite successful in elections and really changing the political terrain. So like, of those 5 topics, just like shout it out out of curiosity, like what do you think is most interesting and most useful?
General strikes, that's good.
General strikes? Austerity, right?
Also critique to the direct democracy movement.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
I would be interested in this constant police operations like Piñata and stuff actually like affecting the whole anarchist movement. Not only the people who are detained or like harassed, but also the whole spirit of the movement. That would be interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So, alright, so I'll focus on those things, and the others I'll mention more briefly, and later if anyone wants to talk about it more, it's not a problem for me. And yeah, one more thing, I'm speaking like personally on the basis of my own experiences as an anarchist, but in all of these struggles, lots of other people participated who weren't anarchists, some people who were anti-capitalists of other varieties, some people who were more reformists or progressives, and of those, maybe some of those people were actually quite sincere in what they were doing and simply had like a different understanding or maybe a little bit less daring in their vision of what they wanted to accomplish, mixed in with people who were participating in those movements as a means to get into power, which has actually succeeded for some of them. So what I'm saying is really on the basis of my own personal experiences, and there's thousands of other people who participate in these same stories. Everyone will give a different perspective. So there's no objective history of this, and I will be referring a lot to anarchists, but these were by no means experiences created by anarchists. This is simply things that a lot of anarchists participated in. So I just want to make that clear. Right, so a little bit of background. When I arrived in Barcelona in 2007, the larger part of the anarchist movement was very firmly overlapping, or pretty generally overlapping with the squatters movement. It was a very identitarian thing. If you were an anarchist, you squatted, and if you squatted, then maybe you were very likely an anarchist if you had developed political views. It was an identity. You know, I'm a squatter, and so when you get evicted, then you squat again because that's just what you do. So that led to like a high degree of isolation, sort of like in-group dynamics, the dynamics sort of an urban tribe. While I'm making that critique, I want to be really clear about one thing. I completely disagree. There's a lot of critiques based on this idea of, at least over there, they talk about the ghetto, as in like the political ghetto, as though it were something that people chose and something that radicals themselves created. And I think that's completely false. And I think that also constitutes a grave misunderstanding of capitalism. Capitalism itself structurally will always isolate and marginalize anyone who challenges society's norms and anyone who struggles. Don't worry about like all the yeah. But then something interesting happened with this general strike, which was pretty much the first general strike, and then maybe little by little I'll go through and just like say the important things. So for 2010, September 29th, general strike. Yeah, thanks. Something interesting happened with this general strike is people started organizing for it in other spaces outside of these two major unions. All right. On the one hand, you had other smaller unions. The third largest union in the country, which is still much smaller than the two big ones, is the CGT, which broke off from the CNT, the anarcho-syndicalist labor union. So it does have an anarcho-syndicalist history, but the reason that they split is because the people who formed the CGT decided to institutionalize and to accept government money, to have paid bureaucrats. But they still have, to differing extents, anti-capitalist views and sometimes more conflicted practices. And then you have the CNT, of course, which is really tiny, and then some other smaller unions in different regions. But then you also had neighborhood assemblies that people started forming. In Barcelona, 6 neighborhoods formed neighborhood assemblies, primarily to talk about how to respond to the austerity measures and how to prepare for the general strike. So that meant that other people besides these union bureaucrats were preparing for the general strike and influencing people in terms of like what a general strike means.
For the translation,
yeah.
And you have some small breaks, so I talk a little slower.
Yeah, great. The next one we should put on is the one that's for January, the minority general strike. So you have these neighborhood assemblies who are entering this conflict, saying what a general strike means, because the major unions wanted to turn a general strike into a protest, into a symbolic protest that they controlled. And the neighborhood assemblies and these other spaces changed that. They created an independent space for preparing for the strike, and that dynamic became even more pronounced in the later general strikes, which I'll talk about later. But that was extremely important. It was a very important precedent to set, that people didn't allow the general strikes to be defined exclusively by the major unions. So anarchists, for example, some of us were participating in the neighborhood assemblies, like me, I started participating in the assembly in my neighborhood. Others, other anarchists, maybe even anarchists who for a long time didn't want to have anything to do with the CNT, started going back to the CNT, participating there, radicalizing that space, also preparing for the general strike there. Spread the idea that a general strike means sabotage, that a general strike means shutting down the economy, that a general strike means forcibly closing businesses and workplaces that are refusing to participate in the general strike. In other words, that the general strike is not democratic and it's not pacifist, but it's a day of disruption. That next one should be 2011, then January 2001, yeah. So in Barcelona, Barcelona had undergone several years of what we can call pacification. For several years, there really hadn't been riots in Barcelona, even though it was like famous as a city for conflicts and anarchists being really strong. To be honest, before that general strike, it had been quite pacified. Part of that was just because of the growing weakness of these anti-capitalist movements and of the anarchist movement, for example, within like the squatting scene. It had sort of played out its strengths and was sort of falling into rotting, you could say. And partially because of a change that came from the state, particularly with the Mossos d'Esquadra, which were formed in Catalonia in like the early part of the decade of 2000, so 2003, 2004, like depending on what part of Catalonia. So the police who deal with riot situations and with protests in the rest of the Spanish state, we could think of as like a typically post-fascist police force, right? Their history and their influences come from the previous fascist regime. So they're basically like big guerrillas, right? They're really scary, and they're like, if there's a protest, they'll even like, so like individual cops will start making homophobic insults or sexist insults, and maybe even like one cop will just go out and start trying to beat up protesters, right? Which on the one hand is very scary and it's dangerous, but on the other hand, it can sometimes create more disorder, right? It can sometimes create situations in which we can fight back and in which we can learn how to fight back and how to defend ourselves, and then these situations get out of hand. So even though it's definitely much more scary to go up against those police, it's actually better for us from a point of view of developing the struggles. The Mossos d'Esquadra, on the other hand, are a completely democratic police force, and much better from the standpoint of the state for maintaining social control. They get their training in the United Kingdom, England, in Germany, and in Israel. And they have a major focus on containing disorder and not letting disorder spread, pacifying situations of conflict in the street rather than just beating people up. They're also extremely disciplined. I haven't been everywhere in Europe, but they're definitely the best riot police force, the most competent riot police force that I've ever seen. They also get a lot of practice, of course, but typically they wouldn't let things get out of hand, and they would very quickly surround the troublemakers, surround the anarchists, and keep them from interacting with their surroundings. Whether interacting means marching side by side in a conflicted or more militant way with other people, or whether interacting means smashing things. It's sort of like when you walk out in the street and you're surrounded by a mobile padded cell, right? Like as though we were in like a lunatic asylum, like this level of capitalist alienation. We can sort of use that as a metaphor. Like you're disconnected from your surroundings, so you can't actually change anything around. And so that was the situation up until this general strike, with a few small exceptions. And in this general strike, the first one of 2010, there was really, really broad participation, something like 80-90% participation of people not going to work. And then also hundreds of thousands, like 100,000 people in the streets, and then riots. You had one group of like anarchists and anti-globalization activists who occupied the big old state bank building right on Plaza Catalunya in the very center of Barcelona, and they turned that into La Casa de la Vaga, the House of the Strike. So sort of like a temporary social center for calling people to participate in the strike, for getting information about the strike, and for encouraging it, for creating this visual symbol to give more power to the strike. The police went to evict that building the day of the strike, and then rioting started, and then spread to different parts of the city. Even led to like a police car getting burned, which was unheard of in Barcelona for a long time. So that was one of the first times when a large group of people was rioting, looting large, big shopping centers, burning banks, and fighting with police. So that really psychologically changed people's idea of what was possible and maybe possible changes to come. 2011, really briefly, on the 27th of January, like the CNT, the CGT, and the other small unions called for a general strike without the participation of the majority unions. All right, so that's why it's referred to as a minority general strike, because the big unions were present. And that's really, really significant because it was much smaller. It only got maybe 30 or 40% participation. The protests weren't as big. There were some sabotage actions and riots, but much smaller. But this showed both the big unions and everybody else that people wouldn't wait. Right? Oh, one thing I forgot. Of course, after the general strike of September 29th, the major unions immediately started negotiating with the government and signing off on the austerity measures, agreeing to the austerity measures. Right? So this minority general strike showed that people, they wouldn't wait. This sort of forced the major unions in the future to call more general strikes for fear of losing all of their support. Because even though the next general strike wasn't as big, it showed that people were willing to go on ahead without the major institutions and to organize themselves. Just opening up like the 1st of May and then the 15th of April. So let's see. As we're talking about this, let's mention other aspects of the anti-austerity struggle. So at this time, you had privatization measures being introduced in education, in healthcare. You had price hikes for the public transportation system. For a while, Barcelona was the most expensive. Public transportation in Barcelona was the most expensive in the whole world relative to the average income, right? So this is both for 2012. Yeah.
What?
These two dates are for 2012 for the next year, the 1st of May and the 15th of May. Oh no, sorry, no, 2011. You're right. Sorry. So. For the most part, these different struggles stayed separated, and that was extremely clear. Like the effects that had of keeping these struggles from radicalizing. As long as people were only talking about healthcare as a separate issue, or education as a separate issue, or transportation as a separate issue, they couldn't radicalize. But for example, within the neighborhood assemblies, which started growing, we increasingly started talking about these issues. For example, in my neighborhood assembly, there were a few people who worked in some of these hospitals, including one hospital that was going to get closed down, and that allowed us to create connections, and also to link this issue to other issues. We did blockade actions. For example, every week we blockaded the main street that went through our neighborhood in solidarity with the workers and the users of this hospital. In the metros, there were actions to open up the metro so everybody could ride for free. Or actions of people getting into the metros and then like not letting the doors close and making a protest in the metro so that they couldn't go, so they were stopped. Lots of protests, things of that nature. Some of the difficulties in that sphere that we ran up against, because eventually all of those movements have sort of disappeared and they haven't really accomplished anything. And I think it's really important to analyze for that reason what the weaknesses were that we found. On the one hand, the unions that were participating made it really difficult. So for example, with transportation, a couple times, the unions were calling for these big, like week-long transportation strikes and getting a lot of help. Like a lot of activists and even anarchists were helping in this process of preparing the strike, doing propaganda for the strike, putting up posters and stuff like that, supporting the strike, doing a lot of like the legwork, the organizing work to support the strike. And then the unions just entered into negotiations without really telling anyone and just sold things out. So they really sort of exploited the labor of anarchists and other activists for their own interests, which was to negotiate, because unions get power by negotiating, and negotiations are exactly what sell out these struggles. One line that we tried exploring that maybe opened up some possibilities was like to feel legitimate with these struggles and not like some second line, like not like just helping out somebody else's struggle, but to have the legitimacy to take this also as our own struggle by taking on the role of users. Okay, so there's the workers in public transportation who are affected by these austerity measures, but then the people who need to use public transportation are also affected. So we should have felt more legitimate to take a certain autonomous line within that struggle, and not to just kind of obey the dictates of the union, which was a recipe for disaster, a recipe for being sold out. Also, one thing that was really confusing was this disconnect between like short-term and long-term goals, because most anarchists, we don't want the system of public transportation, which is useful for getting people to work, between home and work, or to go shopping, or I mean, it's based on also like a very ecocidal system of living. It doesn't reflect our ideal society. So how can we as anarchists fight against the price hikes in public transportation when we're also talking about how this should be free for everyone and the city itself should be transformed. So that was one thing that was difficult, how to navigate that. Also with healthcare, for example. Most of my friends never really got involved in the struggle against the privatization of healthcare because they all had lots of very reasonable critiques against public healthcare and against Western medicine. Western medicine has a completely patriarchal history. It treats people like machines. It's very much related to these different wars against women, against people who aren't cisgendered, against people who aren't heterosexual. Its purpose is basically to fix us, like when we're not working properly, to basically to maintain our labor value. And then public health care, it doesn't belong to us, just like any other public infrastructure. It's not ours. It's provided by the state for its own interests, which aren't our interests. And in this case, basically to maintain a productive workforce. And so when the value of a workforce goes down, for example, from like an industrial workforce to a service sector workforce, there's much less need for a quality public healthcare system to take care of those workers. It doesn't matter as much if more of them are dying or getting sick or whatever because they're expendable. So those critiques were all extremely important to make because everyone else within like the broader anti-capitalist movements and everyone on the left, none of them were making criticisms of public health care. None of them were making criticisms of Western medicine, which is extremely problematic. So I guess for me, just because in the US, like there is no public health care and like since I was 18, I had no access to health care and like when I finally got my papers in Barcelona and then I finally got my medical card, I was able to get like an operation, like a procedure for like a condition that like I had for years that was like a fucking pain in the ass and like also resulted from like labor conditions that I never could have afforded in the US. So even though like the operation was shit and the whole like the process in the hospital treats you like a piece of meat and it's like in a lot of ways unhealthy, I was still really thankful for it because like it was better than nothing. And of course, the whole critique of Western medicine, a large part of it, directs us towards changing the way that we live and also more preventative forms of healthcare. But when you already live in a world that capitalism exists and you have to engage in wage labor, then you already get fucked over. So sometimes in the short term, these different processes of Western medicine are completely necessary. So a couple of us engaged in this process of participating in this movement, participating in the neighborhood assembly, making contacts with hospital workers, holding debates. We actually put out a book which on the one hand talked about like the importance of this movement and some ideas for how this movement could be more effective, and then on the other hand, criticisms of Western medicine and public health care. So we found that one thing that prevented any truly radical action was this dichotomy between public and private, which is essential to this progressive mode of action. It's opposing privatization in favor of the public sphere. But neither of these belong to us. Both of these are harmful for us in different ways. So we found it necessary to talk about a third category, which was communal. So there's private space, public space, and communal space, or private infrastructure, public infrastructure, and communal infrastructure. So what's communal is what actually belongs to us and what we transform. And that actually opens up a sort of pathway, a strategic pathway that goes from occupation to transformation, where if we're occupying these things not as a protest, but actually with the vision of taking them over and making them ours, then within that process, we can actually create the practices of self-organization and we can create the power to determine what is actually good for us and what's useful and what we want to destroy. So that actually opens the door for transformation. Whether it's public transportation or healthcare, because occupation started being used within these movements, but organized by these more progressive groups that always wanted the occupations to be symbolic. A one-day occupation as a protest, and not occupation as a space for taking it over, for transforming it, and if we wanted to, destroying it. right? If we occupy something in an anarchist way, the option always has to be there to destroy it, completely burn it to the ground. If we decide that it's actually not good for us, it's not that it can't be improved, it can't be transformed, and it can't be made to meet our needs. Yeah. So, let's see. Yeah, so that was one of the things that we did in the movement for against privatization and austerity in healthcare. Although of course, we had limited success because there were very few anarchists who were participating in that. And then around the fall of 2011, that movement just sort of died down because it didn't accomplish anything. That's really important to think about, how these more progressive modes of action are self-defeating because they're not exciting for people and they're not useful for people. They just exploit people's energies to create some reform and maybe to let some grassroots politicians get into power. Within that book and then within some other activities, some of the things that we talked about though were projects that put anarchist ideals into practice. So for example, in the part of the book that's talking about like ideals and what we wanted, we mentioned some clinic and hospital occupations in Greece, which were long-term occupations that were actually done with the purpose of putting these, running these hospitals or clinics by the workers. We mentioned some projects made by anarchist comrades in Barcelona who had studied different alternative therapies, alternative forms of healing, Chinese medicine, things like that, and then had started clinics, but with an anti-capitalist analysis, so that these wouldn't just be things for rich people, but they would be accessible for everyone. They would also make themselves accessible to people participating in social struggles, for example, giving therapies or support to people who had been injured or traumatized in protest or by repression, etc. We also mentioned how healthcare was self-organized during the Spanish Civil War, so we said kind of signal like anarchy would be nice, but like wanting something is like a desire that you actually project through your day-to-day life into the future. And like I definitely include myself in this. I think in general we don't know how to want anarchy or what that even means, and we're not debating it. We're not talking about it in our own circles, and we're definitely not talking about it in these heterogeneous spaces like a neighborhood assembly. Like so, we say like, okay, we're the crazy anarchists, so we said, well, we actually are against public health care and Western medicine, but we feel a little bit stupid saying it because, like, we're almost a little bit ashamed of our own ideas. And we know that our criticisms are very good, but at the same time, it's like, it's like we're almost inviting people to ignore us. Like, it's okay if, and like, I don't know, at least in my own experience, like in the neighborhood assemblies where we would try to debate these things, we'd almost be apologetic. Like, you can ignore us. We know that we're the crazy anarchists. We're right. But we know we're the crazy anarchists, so like we're going to say that public health care is bad, but you're just going to say, okay, that's nice, and we're going to continue on with this procedure. So that's a big problem. All right, let's go on to direct democracy. So going back to the timeline. On the 1st of May 2011, you had an anti-capitalist protest that abandoned the usual march routes. Instead of going through the center like usual, it went up into some rich neighborhoods of Barcelona and just destroyed everything. Like torched cars and smashed luxury shops. Like so many windows were smashed that it took almost a week for all of the windows to be repaired. So that meant for like a week, rich people were walking through their neighborhoods and just like chunks of cement like this big were like lodged in like plate glass windows, and like and they just had to, that had to be a part of their reality for a while. One really interesting thing, which confirms one of the arguments against nonviolence, which is that violence alienates people, it scares people away. The media didn't show any of that. The media covered it up. They hid it because I think they made a very realistic evaluation that lots and lots of people across Catalonia would be really excited by images of rich neighborhoods getting fucked up, and that would actually be really, really popular. So they tried covering that up. So we see this sort of growing wave of these conflicted movements, these conflicted rebellious movements. General strikes without the major unions, sabotage actions, a march that goes through the rich neighborhood and smashes everything. And then just 2 weeks later, you have the Real Democracy Now organization, Democracia Raya, from Madrid, putting out a call out for protests in all of the cities of the Spanish state to be followed by occupations of central plaza, where they could hold assemblies. This was a very interesting movement. On the one hand, it contained certain very anti-authoritarian principles, a rejection of political parties, and an emphasis on self-organization in assemblies, on taking over space. These are ideas or principles that up until that moment, pretty much only the anarchists had been advocating and had been talking about. And these were elements that were put in a call-out by a very, very populist organization. So that shows, on the one hand, that these ideas, which mostly anarchists had been spreading, had gotten a lot of support. They generalized. So that's actually good to know, because in the years before this, we always felt very isolated, very irrelevant. But in fact, when we were sort of shouting in the darkness, this was having an impact. So it's important to keep in mind that the things that you're doing, often for years on end, have an impact, and you might not even know it. On the other hand, it also shows that these elements by themselves are not necessarily revolutionary or conflicted. In addition to this, the Real Democracy Now group they enforced strict adherence to nonviolence and the most extreme kind of nonviolence possible. At one moment in the plaza, some people started making a guerrilla garden in the plaza, and the organizers ran up and like, no, you can't, that's violence. So they basically had a very accurate definition of nonviolence. Opposing violence, which is anything that breaks the law. So it's basically a framework that is extremely convenient for the authorities. In addition to nonviolence, their other main characteristic was a push for electoral reform, for constitutional reform. In other words, their demands were exclusively political, only within the sphere of government, right? They had a very, very narrow view. They said, okay, Spain is basically a two-party system, which up until 2011 was true. There was two parties that dominated everything. So we need to change the electoral laws so that more parties can participate, which is extremely myopic, extremely short-sighted, because even just within Europe, there are plenty of other countries that have many different parties participating, and it's the same bullshit, right? So they avoided any kind of global analysis. They avoided any kind of real international. And they were also extremely amnesiac. They had no sense of history. That's something that's very important for me, because in general, anti-capitalist movements in the United States and US culture in general is also very amnesiac. It doesn't make references to history, and in fact radicals will avoid talking about history because it's irrelevant, that just alienates people and makes it seem like you're some strange nerd. And one thing that was very important for me, that I learned from struggles in Catalonia, was the importance of constantly referring to history. Understanding history not as this objective set of facts that exists on paper, but as a sort of animal that needs to be fed, and whose habitat is the streets. And we feed it by talking about it. We feed it by making it present in our activities, in our movements, and by giving it fresh air, by bringing it out into the streets. So anarchists often will do anarchist history tours, will make references to things that have happened 10 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 100 years ago, to show the continuity of events. And I think that's extremely important. The 15th of May movement, the Plaza Occupation movement, could only enforce these reformist perspectives by erasing all of that history. They made no reference to what had happened just 2 weeks earlier with the 1st of May, or to the general strikes, or to decades of very important struggles, because this memory is it's really important because it contains lots of lessons for us within our struggles, that we don't repeat all the same errors. Direct democracy. Some anarchists choose to use direct democracy as a synonym for anarchist practices. For me, the experience of the Plaza occupation movement reinforced the importance of criticizing and opposing direct democracy, of arguing that in some ways anarchy is in fact the opposite of direct democracy, and that direct democracy constitutes the purest form of the state within our movements. So I want to explain that, of course. I guess first an abstract and then with stories. One of the key features of direct democracy, this idea of making decisions through self-organization with assemblies, is a characteristic that is shared with states. And that's a basic emphasis on centralization. Right? These direct democracy movements created spaces, the General Assembly, which were the legitimate space for making decisions. Theoretically, everyone could participate, right? The idea was that everyone comes together and participates, but this one space has more legitimacy than other spaces. Decisions made in this assembly can be enforced on decisions made by a small affinity group, decisions made in a debate in the social center, decisions made in the communal kitchen, where people are cooking for the whole occupation, decisions made spontaneously, decisions made by those same people in other moments of their lives. It created a central space, like a central point from which the whole movement could be observed and coordinated. And that central point is a very important metaphor, because I think strategically anarchists always need to work against, to prevent, or to oppose the emergence or the development of a central space, to make sure that things are always decentralized and therefore impossible to comprehend in their totality, right? So there are like a lot of like rationalist thinking trains us to favor forms of organization that are easy to like schematize, to like drop as like a certain, in an abstract way, right? Like, okay, so this is the space of the General Assembly, here's the this commission and that commission, so a decision has to start here and then go to here and then go there, and then this is happening here, that's happening there, so you can get this bird's eye view of what's happening in the whole movement, or what's happening in the whole plaza. On the contrary, a more anarchic organizing style, I think should look like a Jackson Pollock painting, right? It's like just like chaos, actually. And that's do arrive at a point where I think it's important to actually advocate chaos, which I know like for a lot of like long time anarchists, like, what are you doing? That's like the stupidest thing I can think of. Like, we've been trying so long to like tell people like, no, anarchy like isn't chaos. And that's actually really interesting. Like in the field of politics, it's pretty much the last field where the intelligence of chaos isn't recognized, right? In mathematics, in biology, in quantum physics, in all of these spaces that are like have lots of legitimacy, like, you know, oh, the people who are there are very smart and they know what they're talking about. Chaotic forms of organization it's a commonplace, right? It's systems self-organized. They create their own orders, and then they reach tipping points. A new order arises spontaneously, and then this sort of more like heavily structured organization is just a thin video that we impose on the fundamental chaotic reality of the universe. To wax philosophical. We don't have to use the word chaos. I'm using it like in our propaganda. We can just say anarchy or whatever. Avoid chaos, but I'm using it here to be very, very clear that there is a real difference between democracy and chaos. It's a good thing like the Plaza occupation in Plaza Catalunya actually serves as a metaphor for the whole movement or for organizational structures. I think it's a really good thing when it's impossible for any one person to know what is happening everywhere. Right? When all that you know is what you see. When you have to be rooted in your own subjective experience. And there therefore is no objective experience that can be imposed and prioritized over 10,000 separate, interconnected subjective experiences. And it's good for a lot of different reasons. It's much more difficult for the police to repress a space like that because they don't know what's happening. Right? Like they get there and they would need 1,000 detectives instead of just one to figure out what's happening and where the most important places are. Politicians can't control it, and now I'm referring to grassroots politicians that come from our own movements. That was one of the main debates always between people who favored like a more libertarian practice or a practice of total freedom and decentralization in these spaces, and the politicians who wanted to control them. If there's no one central space, if there's no one microphone that everyone has to listen to, there's nothing for a politician to do. Right? They need a central space in order to direct the whole movement. Because otherwise, all that they can do is what any one of us can do. Just what you do with your own action, your own force, as one more participant in this whole thing. They can't control it. I want to give examples to sort of explain what I mean. So the first day in Plaza there were like 100 people the first night, and then 1,000 people, and then 5,000 people, and then 10,000 people, 30,000. In less than a week, it has exceeded 100,000 people who were coming to the plaza occupation. There were various moments of this plaza occupation. There was like the official moment, which was I think 8 o'clock every evening, which was the General Assembly, which was where decisions had to be made. But then also during the day and late at night, there were lots of other things happening. People were organizing concerts, organizing debates, organizing talks, movie shows, artistic events, meeting strangers, talking, arguing, debating. The anarchists, we set up a literature table to distribute texts that we were publishing every day, like referring to the debates of the day before. And then people would come up and we'd talk with them, and all of this was going on. But a lot of people put the sole emphasis on just this one structure, the General Assembly. So to me, it became apparent that really the only difference between direct democracy and representative democracy is a question of scale. Once you have 10,000 people trying to participate in an assembly, or 100,000 people, true, everyone is voting, right? So you would have like the moderator reading out the proposal on the microphone, and they would ask who's in favor, who is against, who wants more debate. And everyone who's in favor goes like this, and everyone who's against goes like this, and everyone who wants more debate, I can't remember what it is. And if you look at photos from even from the first week of the plaza occupation in Catalonia, which was one of I think the most interesting, one of the biggest and the most dynamic of the entire movement in all of the Spanish state. It looks really impressive at first because it's like you see like a bunch of people sitting down and everyone's like raising their hands like this. But then if you actually look again at the picture, you'll see that in fact at least half of the people aren't raising their hands. They're not voting. Now, with just one picture, you can assume, that's probably because they were going to vote against. But in almost every single vote, there's a curious dynamic. People didn't want to vote against things, right? So they'll vote for something, and very, very few people voted against. So when you see people going like this, that's like the vast majority of anyone who votes on a decision. What that means is most people are abstaining from the vote. Most people aren't voting. Right? So just like in elections with representative democracy, the option that's actually winning out is abstention. So at that level, there's actually no difference. People very quickly were realizing either that these decisions weren't important to them, they didn't actually understand what was being decided, or they didn't feel like they could make a difference. These same feelings that we have in representative democracy were being reproduced in this very important experience in direct democracy. One of the most common phrases that I heard during those weeks were, what did we just vote on? So you have the moderator reading a proposal. Sometimes they didn't even vote on it. What did we just vote on? And we heard that again and again. It was very, very easy for people to manipulate the process. I won't go into like the bureaucratic specific examples, but there's an article about like anarchist participation in the plaza occupation. It's one of the articles that's in this book here, but it's also this is crazy pieces. It's also, if you can get it for free, it's on the Crime Think website, Fire Extinguishers and Fire Starters, but it talks about it in more detail, like an attempt to have like a proposal that would decentralize the assembly, and how that proposal got overwhelming support, and how people controlling the process blocked it every step of the way, and they're using technicalities, they were able to destroy that proposal, even though that was one of the few proposals that most people actually participated in, and like the majority of people voted in favor of. Another similarity is that this experiment was able to create trained bureaucrats. So I mentioned the imposition of nonviolence. This was one thing that was never debated. We were never allowed to debate it. We were just told again and again that no, we already decided on this. The decision has already been made that this would be a nonviolent space. So like any other democracy, there are certain fundamental rules that can't be questioned, and we weren't allowed to question nonviolence. We tried organizing a debate, reserving the central sound system during the day at one point to have like a big debate so that we could express criticism of nonviolence. And not, even not convince anyone, but at least let people know that like this doesn't have consensus, this decision for nonviolence. So we reserved it. We went to, because there are like lots of different commissions. We went to the Activities Commission. We reserved the sound system for 4 o'clock on Sunday. The next day, the paper disappeared. Our reservation disappeared. So we reserved it again. The next day, again it disappeared. But then this time, there was another event using the sound system at that time. So basically, like people who were in the commissions, or who knows, maybe people who were like higher up the structure, were using bureaucratic tricks to control the process, which is something that happens in every democracy. This isn't an exception, and it's not a problem of democracy not working well. That's actually how democracy works and how it's always worked. These forms of manipulation are a systematic part of democracy, and I don't think anyone could provide any example in all of history of a democratic system in which that doesn't happen. People learn how to do that in the space of 1 week, spontaneously in Plaza. All right, so we saw that we'd been defeated. We would not be able to have our debate with the whole plaza about nonviolence. We figured, fuck it. We're still going to organize our debate or like a criticism of nonviolence. We'll do it on the side of the plaza. Remind me to come back to the question of the margins. So we went to the activities. We just organized it on our own. We told people that it would happen. We tried to do propaganda, spread the word. And then that day, we looked at what space was empty. We were like, okay, the staircase over there by the fountain, we'll use that. That's a good space. There's not much noise. We'll just do it there. And we decided, just in case, we'll go to the activities commission. We'll reserve the space so people know that we're there. If people come looking for it, they can see that, okay, that's there. And if the paper disappears again, then we'll go beat up the people from the activities commission. And so we went to the tent, and there was this student volunteer who was at the table. Yes, we'd like to reserve the staircase over there for our debate on nonviolence. And he's like, oh, you can't. And so I was getting really mad, oh yeah, why not? Thinking that he was saying no, we don't want you violent people in our protest occupation. But he looked at his paper and he's like, well, that's not an area. And so this was a piece of paper ripped out of a notebook, and written in pen, in bad handwriting, pink space, blue space, black space, yellow space. And so the Activities Commission had decided to divide the plaza into different spaces, and each space would have a name. And the staircase, where we had decided would be the best space to do our debate, wasn't a named space. And so he's like, I can't, it's not a space. And we're like, just write it down, just write staircase by name. No, but that's not a space. I was I suddenly found myself in the middle of a Kafka novel, right? And this was a perfect bureaucrat. This was the award-winning bureaucrat of the year, and he'd been trained, but perfectly trained in less than 2 weeks, right? He didn't need 4 years at university. He was the best bureaucrat in history, and this direct democracy movement had trained him in just 2 weeks. So that, I think, is also beyond just laughs and giggles. I think that's actually really significant that someone's sense of intellectual freedom and just common sense had been eroded so quickly by these forms. And there's lots of stories like that, other things happening like that. It's not an isolated example. Another important question. Participating. They say, hey, everyone's participating in these decisions. These decisions reflect everyone because we all have a chance to participate, which is why it's better than representative democracy because we're not actually participating there. Even if you just have 1,000 people in an assembly, much less 100,000, not everyone has a chance to speak. Not everyone has time to speak. Then there's also the question of space, types of space. A fundamental value of democracy is equality, and I think that anarchists should actually be opposed to the principle of equality because people aren't equal. No one's equal. Right? We're actually all different, and only within a hierarchical system is difference a problem. Only within a hierarchical society does difference equal privilege and oppression, or different places on that hierarchy. So the principle of equality tries to push us to seek neutral spaces, to seek level playing fields where everyone's equality can manifest, right? So in terms of an assembly, you want to organize the perfect assembly where everyone can have a voice and where everyone can participate as equals. That assembly doesn't exist, right? Every single decision-making space has its advantages and disadvantages. Every space has will have some people who are more comfortable there, who can express themselves better, and other people who can't, right? There's no neutral space, and there's no space where everyone can participate equally. If we try to create such a space, we're inevitably giving priority to some people and taking it away from others. In this big general assembly, that is a space where a very specific kind of person has power. Where a very specific kind of person is most efficient, most effective at communicating. These are people who know how to make the big speeches, who know how to manipulate process and little bureaucratic regulations. Those are the people who will get power in those spaces. Not coincidentally, those tend to be people who are grassroots politicians, who are in these more hierarchical organizations that are seeking to take power in those spaces. So that comes down again to the question of centralization. That within democracy, you need one space which has sovereignty. One space which is the most legitimate, more legitimate than other spaces. Because if you have multiple spaces, maybe in one space they make one decision, and in another space we make another decision. These decisions then enter into conflict. In direct democracy, that's a bad thing. Whereas in anarchic chaos, that conflict is actually a good thing, because that conflict is how we learn. That conflict is how we grow, and also to take space. Like, we don't need to all adhere to the same decision. It's a legalistic form of thinking that we all need to follow the same rules, and it's something that's necessary for the exercise of power, but not for the self-organization of society. Because like maybe over there they like doing things one way, we like doing things our way, we get into conflict and we decide, okay, we can't actually agree, but we don't have to agree, we'll take space. And stateless societies, anti-authoritarian societies throughout history have processes of what anthropologists call fusioning and fissioning, where they have some moments where they come together and other moments where they separate. And that's actually a really healthy part of those societies, because they don't have to oppress one another. I don't have to impose my will on you just because we can't come to agreement on something. We just, okay, we're going to take our space, I'll see you in a few months, and we'll start, we'll participate in other things. And that's actually how the plaza was being organized outside of the General Assembly, in all the margins of the assembly. During the day, a lot of these things were being organized without permission, and it was extremely effective. For example, the Anarchists, we had our literature table. They tried to kick us out, but we refused to go. Every day, individual anarchists or small groups of anarchists were producing texts, open letters, pamphlets, things like that, referring to debates and events that had happened yesterday. So always very, very current. During about a week or two, we printed about 30,000 copies of a few dozen different texts and distributed them for free. And this was all self-organized, right? And a lot you would see people on the other side of the city later in the day reading the conversations came out of these. This was actually a very real form of conversation that was happening. It took the official structures of the General Assembly 2 weeks to put together a text about this long. It took them 2 weeks to do that because they had to come to consensus, right? They had to. I don't know what it said. They had to come to consensus. They had to pass it through the commission, and then through the subcommission, and then to the assembly, and they everyone to vote on it. Why did they do that? Because they wanted a text that spoke for everybody, that reflected everybody's opinion. On the surface, that seems like a really nice idea. It's like, oh, they care about it. They want to have a text for everyone. But that's an impossible proposition. The text that they came out with, I would have burned it. Like it didn't speak for me at all, and it didn't speak for a lot of other people at all. Because you can't have one voice for 10,000 people. That's why all of us have our own voices and our opinions. So this sort of more chaotic, decentralized organization is much more efficient in terms of the needs of the struggle than the centralized format. The centralized format was necessary to control what was going on. Also, what kind of people can participate in this, and how can you participate in this? Not everyone has time to talk, so that there's also not enough time to formulate the proposal in the assembly, right? Democracy often differentiates itself from dictatorship, but we can simplify by saying that in a dictatorship, a very specific faction that controls government has the power to dictate the answers to all the social questions. But in fact, the power to formulate the questions is way, way superior to the power to give the answers. If you can formulate the questions, then you have a much higher degree of control, more developed control, than if you're just giving the answers. So how were the proposals formulated within these direct democratic assemblies? Through commissions, because you had to break up the process, subdivide the process. So in the end, if you wanted to have any more participation than just raising your hand and just being a passive spectator and just giving a very symbolic form of approval, you had to be able to come to the subcommission meeting and spend 2 hours there, and then go to the commission meeting where the proposal would then be accepted and tweaked a little bit and then finalized. And then you had to spend another 3 hours in the General Assembly where that proposal would finally be voted on. So if you didn't have all of those hours in a day to spend, then you weren't really participating in any in-depth way in any specific proposal. Now, of course, the only people who could participate in that are professional activists, people with a higher degree of economic independence, students who don't have to care of ourselves, like the commons. And with the question of repression and anti-repression, the sort of commons that repression is trying to separate us from is the potential support of the rest of society. Right? It's trying to separate us from other people. On the one hand, by designating us as terrorists, by making us seem very scary. On the other hand, by exhausting us with all these activities of support so that we don't have time for our other subversive activities. And also by generating fear, by making people afraid to associate with us, afraid to give solidarity, and all of that. So therefore, if repression is enclosure, then the most important activity of anti-repression is breaking this enclosure. Is creating connections with other people. And so far, in that sense, it's actually been quite successful in Catalonia. The response to Operation Pandora, for example, sparked off the Je también soy anarchista phenomenon, which means I am also an anarchist. And so that was spontaneous protests of thousands of people who came together. Many of them weren't anarchists, they're from maybe more socialist organizations or the Catalan independence left, who went to a protest specifically in support of anarchists. It also became a Twitter feed or whatever, and so for that first week after the Operation Pandora arrest, it was one of the top 5 Twitter feeds in all of Spanish state, or whatever that's worth. So in that sense, a lot of people actually weren't backing away from the anarchists, but on the contrary, supporting the anarchists. And then in fact, we did a lot of things being very public, going to the train station, the metro station with flyers, giving our own version of the events, of what was happening, counter-information, counteracting the media version, and trying to make tens of thousands of copies and handing this out everywhere to people, coming out of the train station, or people in a plaza or something like that. One of the things that basically the police in Spain have created this organization that didn't exist, which was the guise 5-3. 5-3 is an anarchist signature that the European Union has declared a terrorist organization. It's not really an organization, it's just a signature that some people choose to put in communiques when they claim responsibility for sabotage actions. And GAC had nothing to do with them. GAC was Grupos Anarchistas Coordinados, coordinated anarchist groups, which was a coordination of different anarchist affinity groups at the level of the Spanish state, who came together coordinating different campaigns. The biggest thing that they did was to make a book, Contra la Democracia, against democracy. Right? In the media, and like the judge described this as like a terrorist training manual. It's nothing of the sort. It's actually quite boring. It's just like a kind of dry historical and structural critique of democracy and how democracy functions. It's not even like, way like they could make much more radical extreme critiques. It's actually quite like reasonable and balanced. So one of the things that we did, for example, to try to like deflate the strength of this attempted anti-terrorism by the state was across the country we did points of distribution of this supposedly terrorist book, and we advertised it in advance. We said, on this day, we're going to go in the plaza in this neighborhood, in that neighborhood, in this city, in that city, and distribute this book that the government is saying is a terrorist book made by a terrorist organization, so that you all can make up your mind. And in as many places as possible, we distributed the book for free, if we had the funds to do so. Otherwise, we asked people for donations to help with the printing costs. And so that helped reveal the absurdity and the falsity of the state position, because if they really were able to back up their assertion that we were terrorists, then they wouldn't have let us go into all these plazas distributing the book. And we made sure to do that in as wide a way as possible, with a lot of support, a lot of as wide a group of people as possible, so they couldn't claim that we were, some isolated terrorist group. Because if they had to arrest 1,000 people as anarchist terrorists, then it would be very, very clear to all of society that this was a case of political repression, and that terrorism was just a farce. On the strategic level, the last thing that I want to say before it's like breaking this open to discussion, wherever you're doing that, if it's over here or at the other space, is like the difficulty of how do you deal with like the question of like the category of terrorism, right? Because on the one hand, it's important to reveal that like terrorism is a tool of the state, whether that's like actually them who are the ones organizing it as state terrorism, or if they're the ones who are responding to it, but creating it, producing it as a category. Like instead of dealing with this as some other kind of phenomenon, putting it within this framework of values of terrorism, right? And we can also look at the way, for example, this is like a different topic, but the way, for example, that part of the occupation strategy of the United States, depending on in Iraq, was to turn it into a war against terrorism, where like previously in Iraq there had been no presence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS didn't even exist, and the Pentagon very intentionally exaggerated the importance and gave more importance to these like fundamentalist, more easily to describe as terrorist factions within a very, very heterogeneous Iraqi resistance. That was very intentional, so I think we need to talk about that as broadly as possible and get other people in society to think about that. There's the problem of saying, we're not terrorists. Because on the one hand, we want to reveal that this whole thing is a farce, and that their attempt to attack anarchists as terrorists is based on a number of lies. But how can we do that without falling into this discourse of we're not terrorists? Because if you say that we're not terrorists, what you're also saying is that other people are. In a way, you're legitimizing the category of terrorists and creating a sort of line between like what's acceptable in the struggle and what's not acceptable. I mean, personally, I do think that there are things that aren't acceptable in the struggle that anarchists should never do. Like anything that like hurts random people, I think that's fundamentally coming out of an authoritarian logic, where you can just write out people saying, oh, they're just collateral damage. They're just irrelevant casualties. That's something that states do. That comes out of state thinking, and that should never reflect anarchist thinking. And in general, anarchists don't do that. In like the moments in history when anarchists have ever been like killing people, it's not random people. It's actually like in very, very specific moments where they're like assassinating like kings or presidents, or whether they're like in like a situation of warfare against like a civil war or something like that. And it's not just killing random people, but so on the one hand, like I think most of us would agree that there are things that are never acceptable in an anarchist struggle, but then there's the danger of getting into that conversation of where do you draw the line, and like to what extent does that distract attention from the things that we do want to be talking about. So how do you point out that people are being framed without reinforcing discourses of innocence and guilt? So that's something that we're constantly debating, and it's like a fine line that we're trying to navigate. And then finally, there's like the real problem of what we call in Barcelona clandestinitis, like clandestinitis, like when like certain forms or practices of clandestinity are used not as an intelligent strategy, but as sort of just like a knee-jerk reaction. So, for example, the day of or the day after all the arrests and the oppression and the repression, people start being really, really secretive when it's kind of already too late. Right? Like, if you're going to be secretive, you should have done that before the arrest. Like now they have, they've arrested people, they know who we are, and all of that. Like not sharing information, like this sort of like hush hush, not sharing information. I would argue that like that's like in the moment of anti-repression is the moment when you most want to share information. You want information. Sorry. Yeah. You want